The Hells Angels biker followed the little girl across a parking deck to a marked tile, and its secret led to a dead man. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. It was an ordinary evening, the kind where the fading sun casts long shadows across the parking deck of an old building in downtown. The air was cool, with just a slight breeze rustling the papers and loose debris scattered across the lot. The distant hum of traffic echoed in the background, but there was something off about this particular evening. A Hells Angels biker, Jake Reaper Morrison, was making his usual rounds, his motorcycle rumbling as it cut through the stillness. He had no destination in mind, just the need for the open road to clear his mind. He had learned a long time ago that riding was the only thing that kept the memories at bay, the things he'd seen and done that were better left buried. He slowed as he passed the parking deck, noticing a small figure near the corner. At first, he thought it was just another stray, someone waiting for a ride, but then he realized it was a little girl. She was standing by the wall, looking around as if she was waiting for someone. The soft glow of the streetlight illuminated her face just enough for him to see the worry etched across her features. Something about her caught his attention, and without thinking, he turned his bike around and parked at the far end of the deck, watching her from a distance. The girl didn't seem to notice him at first. She was focused on something at the ground, and then, with an unexpected speed, she moved toward a corner of the deck. Jake's instincts kicked in. He wasn't one to get involved in other people's problems, but there was something about her that felt wrong. As he moved closer, he saw what she was doing. She knelt down and brushed aside some dirt and grime from the ground, revealing a small tile beneath it. It was no ordinary tile, Jake noticed. It had a peculiar mark on it. He couldn't make it out from where he was, but something about it felt important. He stayed hidden, not wanting to alert her to his presence just yet. The girl stood up, dusting her hands off, and for a moment, Jake thought she might walk away. But instead, she stepped back and glanced around as if ensuring no one was watching. It was then that she did something Jake wasn't expecting. She reached into her pocket and pulled out something small, a key. With trembling hands, she placed the key into a small slot on the tile. There was a soft click, and to Jake's amazement, the tile slid away to reveal a hidden compartment underneath. He could hardly believe his eyes. What was a little girl doing with a secret like this? What was hidden here, and why was she involved? As he moved closer, he kept himself in the shadows, careful not to make a sound. The girl reached into the compartment and pulled out a small, old-fashioned envelope. She stared at it for a moment, her expression unreadable, before carefully slipping it into her jacket pocket. It was then that she heard something, a noise behind her. Jake froze, his heart racing. He had no idea who or what was coming, but he didn't want to find out. The girl turned quickly, her eyes widening in shock as she saw a man emerging from the shadows, his face hidden in the dark. Jake's grip tightened on the handle of his bike. Something wasn't right. He knew it, and whatever it was, he was about to get pulled into it, whether he liked it or not. As Jake remained hidden in the shadows, his heart raced. The girl, who had been so focused on the strange tile and its hidden compartment, now stood frozen, eyes wide in terror. The man approaching her moved with quiet determination, his steps slow but steady. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a dark silhouette that seemed to swallow the little light the street lamps provided. Jake's instincts screamed that something was off. He knew this wasn't a simple encounter. He had seen enough danger in his life to recognize when things were about to spiral out of control. The girl, still clutching the envelope in her pocket, took a small step back, her hand trembling as she reached for something hidden beneath her jacket. "You don't need to be scared," the man said, his voice smooth but cold. "I'm just here for the package." His words sent a chill down Jake's spine. This wasn't about the girl anymore. It was about whatever secret she had stumbled upon. Jake felt the weight of his decision as he stood there, hidden behind the old rusted dumpster, watching the scene unfold. He wasn't sure what was more dangerous, the man approaching the girl or the secrets they both were tangled in. His fingers tightened around the handlebar of his bike, the metal feeling reassuring under his grip. I told you, I don't know what's in the envelope, the girl replied, her voice shaky, but she stood her ground. Please, just leave me alone. Jake could see the fear in her eyes, the way her shoulders tensed as she backed up toward the edge of the parking deck. The man took another step forward, a glint of something metallic in his hand. A knife, Jake realized, just barely visible in the dim light. You don't get to tell me what to do, he growled, his eyes narrowing. Now, hand it over, and we can forget this ever happened. The girl's breath hitched, but she didn't back down. I don't have it, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You're making a mistake. Jake couldn't take it anymore. He had seen enough. The girl was in danger, and he wasn't going to sit idly by. With one swift movement, he kicked his bike into gear, revving the engine loud enough to catch the man's attention. The sound of the motorcycle roaring to life pierced the quiet night air, and the man spun around, his eyes locking onto Jake's figure as he approached. Who the hell are you? The man snarled, taking a step back, the knife still in his hand. Jake didn't answer right away. He just dismounted from the bike and stood there, letting his presence fill the space between him and the man. The man looked at him, sizing him up, no doubt recognizing the Hell's Angels patch on Jake's leather jacket. Jake took a step forward, his voice low but firm. You don't scare me, he said. And you sure as hell don't scare her. The man hesitated, his grip tightening on the knife. For a split second, Jake thought he might attack, but then something changed in the man's eyes, a flicker of doubt. He glanced back at the girl, who was still standing near the edge of the parking deck, and then back at Jake. This doesn't concern you, the man muttered, taking another step back. Jake didn't let him retreat. He stepped closer, his boots heavy on the concrete. It does now, Jake said. With that, the man turned on his heels and bolted toward the exit, disappearing into the night. Jake watched him go, his mind racing. Why had the man wanted the envelope so badly? And why had the girl been involved? He glanced over at the girl, who was still standing there, her eyes wide with shock. She looked like she might collapse any moment. Without thinking, Jake walked over to her, his voice softer now. You okay? He asked, his tone gentler than he intended. The girl nodded slowly, still holding the envelope tightly in her hand. I think so. She looked up at him, her face pale. Thank you, I thought. Her voice trailed off as she looked back toward the spot where the man had disappeared. What was that about? Jake asked, trying to steady his own racing thoughts. Who was he? The girl hesitated, but then her shoulders slumped, and she seemed to gather the courage to speak. He's part of a group, she said, her voice trembling. A group that's been looking for me. Jake furrowed his brow. Looking for you? What? The girl hesitated again, and Jake could see the conflict in her eyes. She wanted to tell him everything, but something was holding her back. She looked at the envelope again, as if the answer was buried within it. I don't know, she whispered, but I think I'm in deeper than I ever realized. Jake's mind raced. The situation was getting more complicated by the second. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. But first, he needed to make sure the girl was safe. All right, Jake said, his voice steady. Let's get out of here. You can tell me what's going on, but we need to go somewhere safe. The girl nodded, and they both walked toward Jake's bike. As they left the parking deck, Jake's mind was already turning over the possibilities. Who was this group? And what were they after? One thing was certain. The girl had just uncovered a secret, and whatever it was, it had already cost someone their life. As Jake revved the engine of his motorcycle, the girl climbed on behind him, clutching onto him tightly as the cold night air whipped past them. The parking deck was quickly fading into the distance, but Jake could still feel the weight of the encounter lingering in the back of his mind. Who was that man? What did he want with the girl? And what was in that mysterious envelope she had hidden so carefully? These questions bounced around in Jake's mind as they rode down the empty street, the hum of the engine filling the silence. The girl's breath was quick and shallow, but Jake didn't want to ask her too much just yet. He had learned the hard way that pushing someone too hard, especially someone so fragile, could break them. Instead, he focused on getting them both out of harm's way. A few miles down the road, Jake pulled into a small, rundown motel on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place that didn't ask too many questions, which was exactly what they needed. As he killed the engine, the girl slipped off the bike and looked around cautiously, as though expecting someone to follow them. Jake walked up to the door, unlocked it, and gestured for her to enter. She hesitated for a moment, but then stepped inside. The room was small and sparse, with just a bed, a small table, and a bathroom. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give them some space to figure things out. Once the door was shut, the girl let out a long breath, as though she had been holding it in for hours. "You can sit down," Jake said, motioning to the bed. "I'll grab us something to drink." He moved toward the small fridge and pulled out a couple of bottled waters, handing one to the girl. She took it without saying a word, her hands still shaking slightly. Jake could see the fear in her eyes, the weight of what she had just gone through. He wasn't sure how much she knew, but she had clearly stumbled into something far bigger than herself. "You want to tell me what's going on?" Jake asked, his voice softer now. The girl looked up at him, her eyes clouded with confusion and fear. "I don't know where to start," she said, her voice shaky. "I didn't mean to get involved in this. I found something. And now they're after me." Jake sat down across from her, leaning forward slightly. "What did you find?" She glanced at the envelope in her pocket, as if it were a ticking time bomb. "I don't know. It's just something my dad left behind." Her voice faltered. "He was involved in something, and now I'm caught up in it too." Jake leaned back, trying to make sense of what she was saying. Her father had been involved in something. That explained the attention, but it didn't explain why she was the one holding the key. "What was your dad involved in?" he asked, his curiosity getting the best of him. The girl bit her lip, clearly torn about what to share. "He was part of a group," she said slowly. "A secret group. They were doing things that no one was supposed to know about. I didn't know any of it. But now, I think I'm in the middle of it." Jake raised an eyebrow. "What kind of things?" The girl hesitated. "I don't even know what the group was really about. But I found some files in his things. And one of them—" She paused, swallowing hard. "One of them had the names of people who had disappeared. People he knew." Jake could feel his pulse quicken. This wasn't just about a missing person or a stolen document. This was something much bigger. Something dangerous. "And that envelope?" he asked. The girl looked at it again, her hand trembling as she pulled it out of her jacket. "It's a list," she said. "A list of names. People who were involved in whatever my dad was part of. I think it's what they've been looking for." Jake's mind was racing now. This was a puzzle with missing pieces, but it was clear that the pieces she had found were enough to get her, and probably him, into a whole lot of trouble. He had no idea who they were, but he knew one thing. They were dangerous. "So what do we do now?" Jake asked. The girl shook her head. "I don't. No. I just wanted to leave all of this behind. But now they're coming for me." Jake's eyes softened. "You're not alone in this." The girl looked up at him, surprise flashing across her face. "What do you mean?" Jake stood up, moving toward the window and looking out into the parking lot. "I mean you're not going to handle this by yourself," he said, his voice firm. "I don't know what's going on, but I've been in enough fights to know when something's bigger than it seems. And right now, you need someone who's been through this kind of thing." He turned back to face her. "I'm not leaving you here, all right? We're going to figure this out. Together." The girl stared at him for a moment, her expression uncertain. "But I don't even know who you are," she said. "You're a biker. A Hell's Angel. Why would you help me?" Jake smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. "Because, kid, I've seen enough to know that not everyone who looks dangerous is. And not everyone who's been through hell stays there. I don't know what's going on here, but I know we're not leaving until we figure it out." The girl nodded slowly, as though she was starting to believe him. "All right," she said. "But we can't stay here for long. They'll be looking for me." Jake walked over to the door, locking it securely behind him. "Don't worry," he said, his voice calm and steady. "We're getting out of here. But first, we need to find out who's after you and why." The morning light filtered through the curtains of the small motel room, casting soft shadows across the floor. Jake sat at the small table, his fingers drumming lightly against the wooden surface as his mind raced. The girl, whose name he had learned was Emma, had finally fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted from the events of the night. He couldn't blame her. The weight of everything she had learned, the danger she had faced, it was a lot for anyone to process, let alone a kid. But as much as he wanted to let her rest, Jake knew they couldn't afford to stay in one place for long. Whoever was looking for her wasn't going to give up. He stood and walked over to the window, peering out through the blinds. The parking lot was quiet, but Jake knew better than to assume everything was safe. He had been in enough situations to know that quiet could be deceiving. The girl had no idea what she was truly up against, But Jake was beginning to piece things together. The envelope she had found, the names, the people who had disappeared, it all pointed to something far bigger than a simple missing persons case. This wasn't just about Emma anymore. She had stumbled onto something dangerous, and now she was a target. He glanced at the door, considering his options. They needed to leave, but where would they go? He couldn't take her back to his club. That would only draw more attention. They needed to disappear for a while, find out who was after her and why. As if on cue, Emma stirred on the couch, her eyes fluttering open. She rubbed her eyes, blinking at the unfamiliar surroundings. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice still thick with sleep. Jake turned to face her, offering a reassuring smile. "We're safe for now," he said. "But we need to move. We can't stay here for too long." Emma sat up, her expression worried. "Are they still looking for me?" Jake's smile faded. He didn't want to lie to her. "They're looking for the envelope you found," he said, his voice steady. "And they won't stop until they get it." Emma swallowed hard, her hands shaking slightly as she gripped the edge of the couch. "I didn't mean to get involved in all this," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to know what happened to my dad." Jake nodded, his eyes softening. "I get it. But now, you're involved, and we need to figure out who's after you and why." Emma looked at him, her eyes filled with fear and uncertainty. "What if they hurt me?" she asked. Jake's expression hardened. "They won't," he said firmly. "I'm not going to let them." He walked over to his jacket, retrieving the old, worn map he kept hidden in one of the pockets. "We're going to figure this out, Emma. But we need to move. I've got a friend who can help. Someone who can get us out of town for a while." He unfolded the map, spreading it across the small table. "We're going to head to the next town over. It's small, off the radar. We'll lay low, figure out our next move." Emma nodded, though there was still hesitation in her eyes. "And the envelope?" she asked. Jake glanced down at the map, his fingers tracing the lines of the roads. "We keep it hidden," he said. "No one gets their hands on it until we know who's behind all of this." Emma stood up, looking over the map. "What if they find us there?" she asked, her voice laced with doubt. Jake stood tall, his gaze never wavering. "They will," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But we'll be ready for them." He looked at Emma, his expression softening. "Listen, I know this is scary, but you're not alone in this. I'm not going to let anything happen to you. You've got my word on that." Emma looked up at him, searching his face for sincerity. After a moment, she nodded. "Okay," she said quietly. "Let's go." As Jake gathered his things, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The people after Emma were relentless, and the longer they stayed in one place, the more likely it was they would be found. He had no idea who was behind it all, but he knew one thing. Whoever they were, they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. The envelope was just the beginning. Jake zipped up his jacket and grabbed his helmet, turning toward Emma. "Stay close," he said as they walked out of the room. "And don't let anyone see you." Emma nodded, clutching her jacket tightly around her. She didn't say anything else as they made their way to the bike. Jake mounted his motorcycle, waiting for her to climb on behind him. As she did, he revved the engine, the rumble vibrating through his chest. He wasn't sure what they were up against, but he knew they couldn't stay here any longer. They had to find out who was behind all of this, and fast. As they rode off into the night, Jake kept his eyes on the road ahead, but his mind was racing. There were too many unknowns, too many questions without answers. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that whoever was chasing them would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. Emma was just a kid, caught up in something way bigger than herself, and it was up to Jake to protect her. He had no idea where this road would lead, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let them get her. Not on his watch. As Jake and Emma rode through the dark, empty streets, the cold wind cut through the night, biting at their faces. Jake's mind raced with each turn of the motorcycle's wheels. The farther they got from the motel, the more exposed they felt, but he knew there was no turning back now. Emma was still clinging to him, her small frame pressed against his back, her grip tight, but not from fear. It was something else, something deeper. She trusted him, even after everything that had happened. Jake was doing everything he could to keep her safe, but in the back of his mind, he knew this was only the beginning. Whoever was after her wasn't going to stop, and that meant there would be no rest for either of them until they figured out who was pulling the strings. The road ahead was clear, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in on them. He glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights behind them. But it was just the empty stretch of road, the only sound the rumble of his bike and the soft wind. He couldn't relax, not for a second. They had to get to the safe house. Jake had a contact there, a guy who owed him a favor, someone who could help them figure out their next move. The plan was simple: lay low, keep their heads down, and find out what was really going on. They'd only been on the road for a couple of hours when Jake saw a flicker of light in the distance, a small gas station on the outskirts of the next town. It wasn't much, but it was a place to stop, get their bearings, and figure out the next step. Jake slowed down as they pulled into the station, the bike's engine purring to a stop. The place was dark, the only light coming from the flickering neon sign above the pumps. It looked like it had been years since anyone had bothered to fill the tanks. Still, it was better than nothing. As Jake dismounted the bike, Emma slipped off the back and looked around. Cautiously, Jake glanced over his shoulder, making sure no one had followed them. He didn't think anyone had, but they couldn't afford to be careless. "Stay close," he muttered, his voice low. Emma nodded, her eyes scanning the dark corners of the station. "I'll be right back," Jake said, moving toward the door of the small convenience store attached to the gas station. He pulled on the handle and pushed the door open. The bell above the door jingled softly as he entered, and the stale air hit him immediately. The place was empty, save for a tired-looking man behind the counter, his eyes barely open as he flipped through a magazine. Jake walked up to the counter and leaned on it, his gaze never leaving the man. "You the only one here?" Jake asked, his tone sharp. The man looked up, startled, before nodding. "Yeah," he muttered, wiping his eyes. "What can I do for you?" Jake reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled map. He spread it out on the counter, pointing to a small town about 50 miles away. "I need directions," Jake said. "Somewhere safe. You know a place?" The man squinted at the map, rubbing his chin. "There's a town a ways out," he said slowly, pointing to the map. "Not much there, but it's quiet. Nobody bothers you." Jake nodded, committing the directions to memory. He didn't need much. They weren't staying long anyway. "Thanks," Jake said, dropping a few bills on the counter. He turned to leave, but then paused, glancing over at Emma, who had stepped into the store, looking around nervously. The man behind the counter eyed her, his gaze lingering longer than it should have. Jake felt his muscles tense. "She's with me," he said, his voice a warning. The man nodded quickly, his eyes flicking between Jake and Emma. Jake didn't trust the guy, but it wasn't worth making a scene. They had more important things to worry about. As they stepped back outside, Jake could feel Emma's eyes on him, her curiosity barely contained. "What's going to happen now?" she asked, her voice small. Jake mounted his bike, turning the key in the ignition. "We keep moving," he said. "We get to the next town, lay low, and figure out who's behind this." Emma climbed on behind him, her grip tighter this time, as if holding on not just for safety, but for something else. Jake could feel her fear, but there was something else too: hope. She wanted to believe they could get through this, and for her sake, Jake would make sure they did. As they sped off into the night, the wind whipping around them, Jake couldn't help but think about what they had uncovered. The envelope, the names, the people who had disappeared. This wasn't just a coincidence. Someone had gone to great lengths to keep this secret hidden, and if they thought Emma would stay out of it, they were wrong. He wasn't going to let anyone hurt her. They had a long road ahead, but Jake wasn't afraid. He had been through worse, and he would do whatever it took to protect Emma, no matter who was after them, no matter what secrets they had uncovered. They were in this together now, and Jake wasn't going to let go. As Jake and Emma continued their ride, the dark highway stretched out ahead of them, the wind biting at their faces as they sped through the night. Jake kept his eyes on the road, but his mind was still processing everything that had happened. The information Emma had shared with him earlier, the envelope, the names, none of it made sense. There was something big going on, and whatever it was coming for them. They had to keep moving. The town the gas station clerk had mentioned was still about 30 miles away. It wasn't much, but Jake figured it was enough of a safe haven to regroup. They needed to find out who was after Emma, and fast. The last thing Jake wanted was for her to get hurt, especially when she was just a kid caught in the middle of something she didn't understand. The night was still, almost eerily so, and the only sound was the rumble of Jake's motorcycle cutting through the silence. Emma was pressed against his back, her hands tightly gripping his sides, and he could feel her small frame trembling. You holding up all right? Jake called back over his shoulder. Emma nodded, though Jake could hear the fear in her voice. I'm okay. Just a little scared. Jake's grip on the handlebars tightened, his jaw clenching. He couldn't let her see how much he was worried. The world she had been thrown into wasn't the kind of place for someone like her. She deserved better. But he had made a promise, and he was going to keep it. They couldn't stop until they figured out who was behind all of this. As they entered the outskirts of the next town, the streetlights flickered to life, casting a dim glow over the cracked pavement. Jake slowed the bike, taking the first right turn he saw. It led them down a narrow street lined with old houses and small shops that looked like they hadn't seen business in years. The place seemed deserted, but that was exactly what they needed right now. A place to lay low. Jake spotted a small motel at the end of the street, its neon vacancy sign flickering weakly in the distance. It wasn't much, but it would do. He turned the bike into the parking lot and parked it near the far end, away from the street. As he shut off the engine, Emma slid off the back and glanced around nervously. Do you think we're safe here? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake looked around, scanning the quiet street. It didn't seem like anyone had followed them, but they couldn't be sure. For now, yeah, he said, his voice steady. We just need to keep a low profile and figure out what's going on. They walked into the motel office together, the bell above the door ringing softly as they entered. The clerk behind the counter barely looked up from the TV. Just a room for the night, Jake said, his tone casual. The clerk nodded, handing over a key without a word. Room 6, he muttered. Jake paid in cash, not wanting to leave any trail behind. They made their way down the narrow hallway to their room, and Jake unlocked the door with a quiet click. Inside, the room was simple, with a single bed, a small table, and an old television on the dresser. It wasn't much, but it was better than being out on the street. Jake pushed the door shut behind them and locked it. Emma immediately sank onto the bed, her shoulders slumped in exhaustion. Jake stood by the window, looking out into the darkened parking lot. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Whoever was after Emma wasn't going to stop. He had to find out who was behind this and why. But there was something else nagging at the back of his mind. Something wasn't adding up. Why had Emma's father gotten involved in whatever this was? And why had he kept it from her? Jake knew it was only a matter of time before the people who were chasing them found their trail. He couldn't let that happen. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. Emma had fallen asleep on the bed, her body curled up in a tight ball. Jake sat down in the chair by the window, his eyes never leaving the parking lot. He wasn't going to let anything happen to her. Not on his watch. The night stretched on, quiet and still, but Jake knew that the calm was only temporary. Soon, they would have to face the people who were after Emma. And when that time came, he would be ready. The weight of his past, of the Hell's Angels, and everything he had left behind, pressed down on him like a heavy cloak. But for Emma, he would do whatever it took to protect her. The sound of a car door slamming outside made Jake's head snap toward the window. His heart skipped a beat. He couldn't see much, but the sound was enough to send a chill down his spine. Someone was out there. He could feel it. Without a word, Jake stood and moved to the door. He motioned for Emma to stay put, and she nodded, her eyes wide with fear. Jake cracked the door open just enough to peer outside. There was a black sedan parked across the street, the headlights off, but the engine was still running. Jake's instincts told him to stay hidden, to wait and see if it was just some random car. But something told him this wasn't just a coincidence. He closed the door softly and walked back to the window, watching the car carefully. The sound of footsteps outside made his muscles tense. Someone was definitely out there, and they were getting closer. The question was, who were they, and what did they want? As Jake watched the black sedan, his instincts told him they were being watched. The car had been idling for too long, and its presence felt too deliberate to be a coincidence. His hand hovered near the door handle, and his gaze kept darting back to Emma, who was sitting silently on the bed, her wide eyes reflecting the same fear that churned in his stomach. The footsteps he had heard earlier grew closer, now unmistakable as someone moving around outside. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be discreet anymore. Jake's fingers tightened around the edge of the window frame. He could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. He needed to act quickly before things escalated further. He turned back to Emma. "Stay here," he whispered, though he knew she wouldn't argue. The terror on her face told him all he needed to know. She wasn't just scared for herself. She was scared for him, too. Without another word, Jake quietly moved toward the door, taking one last glance at the room to make sure Emma was safe. Then, he slipped out into the hallway, trying to remain as quiet as possible. His boots barely made a sound on the worn carpet as he moved toward the back exit of the motel. He needed to get a better look at who was outside, and the back alley gave him a clear view of the parking lot. Jake reached the exit and carefully pushed the door open. The cold night air hit him immediately, sending a shiver down his spine. He leaned out, scanning the parking lot. The black sedan was still there, parked a little farther back, but the headlights were off now, making it harder to see. Jake's eyes narrowed. A figure emerged from the car, tall and broad-shouldered, walking toward the motel. Jake's hand instinctively went to the handle of the knife he kept tucked in his jacket. He wasn't about to get caught off guard. The man was dressed in dark clothes, his face hidden in the shadows, but Jake could tell he was carrying something in his hand. A gun? A flashlight? Whatever it was, Jake wasn't going to wait around to find out. He needed to create a diversion. He quickly glanced around the alley, his mind racing for a plan. He noticed a row of trash cans and dumpsters at the far end. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to give him some cover. Jake moved quickly, silently making his way to the dumpsters. He ducked behind them, trying to steady his breathing, but his heart was pounding in his chest. The man was getting closer, the sound of his footsteps growing louder. Jake didn't have much time. He scanned the alley again. There had to be something he could use. His eyes landed on an old, rusted fire escape ladder leading to the roof. A perfect escape route. If he could get up there, he could get a better vantage point and figure out what was going on without being seen. Jake moved toward the ladder, his footsteps light and careful. He reached for the bottom rung and pulled himself up, gritting his teeth against the string. His body was still recovering from the injuries he'd taken over the years, but he knew he couldn't afford to hesitate. As he reached the top of the ladder and pulled himself onto the roof, he paused for a moment, catching his breath. He looked back toward the motel, hoping Emma was still safe inside. Then, he turned his attention to the parking lot below. From his position, he could see the man clearly now. He was pacing near the entrance, his hand still hidden in his jacket. Jake's eyes narrowed. Something about this man didn't sit right with him. He didn't belong here, and Jake had a feeling he wasn't alone. The man kept glancing around, like he was waiting for someone. Jake's gut tightened. Whoever he was waiting for, it wasn't just a casual visit. This man had a purpose. Jake needed to find out who he was working for, and fast. He crouched low on the roof, peering over the edge. As he watched the man, he noticed something strange. The man was looking at his phone, typing something, but then he paused and glanced around nervously. A second figure appeared from the shadows, moving swiftly toward the first man. This one was smaller, but just as menacing. Jake's hand instinctively went to his knife again. He needed to act now. He could either stay hidden and gather information, or he could confront them head-on. He wasn't one for waiting around, but he couldn't risk Emma's safety either. He stayed low and listened carefully. The two men were speaking in low voices, too quiet for Jake to hear, but he could see their body language clearly enough. The second man handed something to the first, probably a bag or an envelope. Jake's heart skipped a beat. Was this the package that had caused all the trouble? The one Emma had found? He couldn't be sure, but it looked like they were making a transaction. Jake's mind raced. He needed to get closer, but the risk of being spotted was too high. He scanned the roof, looking for a way down. The fire escape on the other side of the building would get him closer, but he didn't know if he had enough time before the men moved. He was running out of options. As he debated his next move, a new sound caught his attention. The unmistakable sound of an engine revving in the distance. Another car was approaching. Jake's heart sank. Whoever these men were, they weren't alone. They were part of something much bigger, and it was all starting to come together. They were getting closer, and Jake needed to make his move. The game had changed, and now, he had no choice but to jump in head first. As Jake crouched low on the rooftop, his mind raced through the options. The new car approaching meant trouble, and it wasn't just a random passerby. He had no way of knowing for sure who was behind the wheel, but the timing was too perfect. His heart pounded as he scanned the scene below. The two men were still talking in low voices, handing something between them. It was clear they were involved in something shady, but Jake couldn't figure out just how deep it went. The small man with the phone had stepped back slightly, as though to make room for the car, but Jake noticed the first man didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the approaching vehicle. It was hard to make out the details in the darkness, but Jake could tell that whoever was inside was expected. The car's headlights swept across the parking lot, illuminating the ground and casting long shadows on the walls. Jake's instincts screamed for him to stay hidden, but the urge to find out what was going on was overwhelming. Whoever was after Emma wasn't going to stop until they had that envelope. And the way the men had been acting, it was obvious they were involved in something bigger than a simple transaction. The engine of the car slowed, the tires crunching against the gravel as it came to a stop near the two men. Jake's eyes locked on the scene below. The first man stepped forward to greet the car, and the smaller man stood back, watching closely. Jake's heart rate increased as the car door opened, and a tall figure emerged from the shadows. The man was dressed in black, his face obscured by a hood, but there was something about him that made Jake's stomach turn. This wasn't a simple runner or a thug looking for trouble. This man was dangerous. Jake instinctively reached for the knife tucked in his jacket, his fingers wrapping around the cool handle. He was ready. He had to be. The man from the car exchanged a few words with the first two men, his voice low and calm, but there was a tension in the air that was palpable. The conversation was brief, but Jake could tell something was happening that wasn't supposed to. The car was still running, idling in the parking lot, its lights casting an eerie glow across the entire area. As the tall man finished his conversation, he reached into the car, pulling out a large, metal briefcase. His movement was deliberate, measured. Jake watched as the first man stepped forward, eagerly reaching out to take the case. But before the man could get close, the tall figure shook his head, pulling the case back just enough to keep it out of reach. "Not yet," the tall man said, his voice carrying a sharp edge. "We need to move first. Then we'll deal with it." The first man nodded, clearly eager but waiting for further instructions. Jake couldn't make out all of their words, but it was clear that whatever was inside that briefcase was important. And the longer this dragged on, the more dangerous it was becoming. He had to act fast. Without hesitation, Jake stood and moved quietly along the edge of the roof, his boots making little noise on the gravel. He needed to find out what was in the briefcase, and more importantly, who these men were working for. As he neared the fire escape, he glanced down at Emma, who was still inside the room, her face pressed against the window, watching him. Her eyes were wide with worry, but there was something else there too, trust. She was scared, but she was trusting him to protect her. He couldn't let her down. He reached the fire escape and began climbing down, each movement smooth and calculated. As he reached the ground, he crouched low, moving swiftly toward the edge of the parking lot. The men were still distracted, talking among themselves, unaware that Jake had moved in closer. He crept around the back of a nearby dumpster, his heart pounding in his chest. His eyes locked on the metal briefcase, still clutched tightly by the tall man. It was just a few feet away. He could make it. Just a few more steps, and he would have a clear view of the case and what was inside. But just as Jake took a step forward, he froze. A shadow moved in the corner of his eye. A figure was emerging from the darkness, moving swiftly toward the group of men. Jake's heart skipped a beat. Another player. This wasn't just about Emma anymore. There were too many people involved in this, too many moving parts. The figure in the shadows was closing the gap between them. He wasn't sure if they were friend or foe, but he couldn't let them get any closer. Jake's instincts kicked in, and he made his move. He darted to the side, just out of sight of the men, and pressed his back against the wall of the building. His breathing was steady, and his fingers hovered over the knife, ready to make his move. The figure had reached the group now, and Jake could hear muffled voices. There was a brief exchange before the figure nodded and walked away, disappearing into the shadows just as quickly as they had arrived. The tension in the air was palpable. Jake couldn't make out all of the details, but he knew one thing for sure. The envelope, the briefcase, it all connected to something far bigger than he could have imagined. Whoever was after Emma was playing a dangerous game, and Jake was about to become a part of it whether he liked it or not. The cold night air pressed in on Jake as he crouched behind the dumpster, watching the men in the parking lot. His pulse was pounding in his ears, and the events of the last few hours felt like a blur. Too many questions, too few answers. The tall man who had arrived in the black sedan was now standing with the two others, the briefcase between them. They exchanged words that Jake couldn't quite hear, their voices muffled by the distance. But something about the way they were acting told him this wasn't just a casual meeting. They were up to something big, and Emma was caught in the middle of it. Jake's mind raced. He needed to figure out what was going on, and he needed to do it fast. Whoever was after Emma had to have some kind of plan, and Jake had no intention of letting her get swept up in it. He looked back at the motel room, his eyes catching a glimpse of Emma through the window. She was still inside, but he knew she wouldn't be safe for long if things kept escalating. He had to keep her out of sight. As Jake stayed crouched behind the dumpster, the tall man with the briefcase glanced around, his eyes scanning the area, stopping for a moment at the fire escape ladder on the side of the building. Jake held his breath, frozen in place. Was he being spotted? The man seemed to hesitate for a moment, then turned his attention back to the others. Jake exhaled slowly, letting his muscles relax. He couldn't afford to make any more mistakes. The figures below continued to talk, but Jake's focus was elsewhere. His mind kept returning to the briefcase. Whatever was inside, it was clearly important. The urgency in the way the men handled it, the way they guarded it, it all pointed to something serious. And now they were trying to find Emma. Jake clenched his fists, frustration building in his chest. He had been on both sides of this kind of game before, but the stakes were higher this time. Emma wasn't just some pawn in this twisted game. She was a kid, and she deserved to be safe. He had promised her that. The man with the briefcase suddenly turned, his gaze locking onto Jake's position. For a moment, Jake froze, but then his instincts kicked in. He dove behind the dumpster, ducking low as the man's eyes swept over the area. Jake couldn't tell if the man had seen him or if it was just a passing glance. Either way, he wasn't going to risk being caught. He had to move. He stayed low to the ground, moving quickly and quietly toward the back of the building. The sound of his boots on the gravel was muffled by the wind, and he felt the adrenaline kicking in as he made his way to the alley behind the motel. He needed to find out what was going on, but getting closer to the men wasn't an option. If they had eyes on the parking lot, they would spot him instantly. Jake took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He had to think this through. As he turned the corner into the alley, he spotted an old utility shed. It wasn't much, but it could give him a place to hide and observe. Without thinking twice, he moved toward it, keeping his body pressed against the wall. The shed was old and rusted, but the windows gave him a perfect view of the parking lot. From here, he could see everything: the men, the briefcase, and the sedan still parked in the distance. His heart skipped a beat when he saw the tall man take the briefcase and walk toward the car. Jake's eyes followed him, trying to make sense of what was happening. The man reached the car and slid the briefcase into the back seat. Then, without a word, he got into the driver's seat, and the car started up. The engine roared to life, and the car pulled out of the parking lot, disappearing into the night. Jake's heart pounded as he watched them leave. What was in the briefcase? Who were they working for? And why were they after Emma? He needed to move fast. The group had clearly just made a deal, but he didn't know if they were coming back or if they had finished whatever business they were conducting. He couldn't risk staying here too long. Jake turned and ran back to the motel, his mind racing with the possibilities. As he approached the room, he heard a faint sound, a low, grating noise coming from the hallway. His eyes darted toward the door, and his hand instinctively reached for the knife at his belt. Slowly, he pushed the door open just enough to peek inside. Emma was standing by the window, her back to the door. She was staring out, but her eyes were wide with fear. Jake's heart sank. She hadn't heard him approach. Without a word, he slipped inside, his voice barely above a whisper. "Emma," he said, his voice calm but firm. She turned, startled. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice shaky. Jake didn't answer immediately. He couldn't. The urgency in her eyes told him everything. They were running out of time. "We need to go," he said. "Now." Emma nodded, her expression turning serious. She grabbed her jacket and followed him without hesitation. "Are they coming for us?" she asked as they made their way to the door. Jake didn't answer at first. He wasn't sure what to say. The truth was, he didn't know who was after them or what they wanted. But he did know one thing. He wasn't going to let anyone hurt her. Not if he could help it. As they stepped out into the night, Jake kept his eyes scanning the darkened parking lot, listening for any sound that didn't belong. He didn't know how much longer they had before the men returned, but they couldn't afford to wait around. They had to keep moving, keep staying one step ahead. Emma was counting on him, and that was all the motivation Jake needed. The cold night air was filled with tension as Jake and Emma moved quickly through the dark streets. They hadn't spoken much since they left the motel room, and the silence between them felt heavy. The glow of the streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement, but Jake's eyes were scanning every corner, every alleyway. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Whoever was chasing them, whoever wanted what was in that envelope, they were closing in. The thought that Emma was caught in the middle of it all gnawed at him. He had sworn to protect her, but with every move, the danger seemed to grow more real. The muffled sound of a distant engine broke through the silence. Jake tensed, his muscles coiled, ready for anything. He glanced over at Emma, who was still walking beside him, her small frame barely visible in the dim light. She was quieter than usual, her face a mask of determination, but Jake could see the fear behind her eyes. "Stay close," he said, his voice low but firm. Emma nodded without a word, her grip tightening on her jacket as she quickened her pace to match his. The sound of the engine grew louder, and Jake could tell it was getting closer. He wasn't sure who was in the car, but he didn't need to take any chances. They needed to get out of sight, fast. Jake spotted a narrow alley to the left and motioned for Emma to follow him. Without hesitation, they darted into the alley, their footsteps muffled by the trash-strewn ground. The alley was dark, but it offered some cover, and Jake hoped it would be enough to hide them for a while. They crouched behind a large dumpster, staying still and silent. The sound of the car's engine stopped just outside the alley, and Jake's heart skipped a beat. Whoever it was, they were close. Too close. He peered around the corner, just enough to catch a glimpse of the car. It was a black sedan, the same one that had been parked in the motel lot earlier. Jake's stomach twisted. They were being hunted, and the hunters were right on their tail. He turned back to Emma, his voice barely above a whisper. "Stay here," he said. "Don't move, no matter what." Emma's eyes widened, and she opened her mouth to speak, but Jake put a finger to his lips, silencing her. He couldn't afford to have her get caught up in whatever was about to happen. With a final glance at Emma, Jake moved cautiously toward the entrance of the alley, keeping low to the ground. He had to know what was going on. The car doors creaked open, and Jake heard the sound of footsteps. 2 men stepped out, both wearing dark clothes and moving with purpose. They didn't look like anyone who should be in this part of town, and their body language screamed danger. Jake's gut instinct told him they were trouble. The 2 men started walking down the alley, their eyes scanning the area. One of them pulled out a flashlight, sweeping it across the walls and dumpsters. Jake pressed his back against the brick wall, holding his breath as the beam passed just inches from where he was hiding. The men didn't seem to notice him. They continued down the alley, muttering to each other in low voices. "She's got to be close," one of them said. She couldn't have gone far. Jake's heart sank. They were looking for Emma. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. They knew she had something they wanted, and they were willing to do whatever it took to get it. He didn't know who these men were or who they worked for, but Jake wasn't about to let them take her. Not without a fight. The men stopped in front of the dumpster, their flashlight beams landing on the pile of garbage. Jake's hand instinctively went to the knife at his waist, but he didn't want to reveal himself just yet. He needed to wait for the right moment. As the men exchanged a few more words, Jake noticed something that sent a chill down his spine. One of them pulled out a radio and spoke into it in hushed tones. "Target's still not clear. Moving to the secondary location." Jake's pulse quickened. Secondary location? That meant they had a plan. They weren't just looking for Emma. They were preparing to move her somewhere. He needed to know where. The men began to walk back toward the car, their voices fading as they moved further down the alley. Jake stayed in place, holding his breath until he was sure they were gone. When the footsteps finally disappeared, he let out a quiet sigh of relief. He had to move quickly. He had to warn Emma. He crept back down the alley, staying low to the ground as he retraced his steps toward the dumpster. Emma was still there, crouched down in the shadows, her eyes wide with fear. She looked up as Jake approached, her face filled with worry. "What's happening?" she whispered. "They know we're here," Jake said, his voice low but urgent. "They're looking for you, Emma. They know you have something they want." Emma's breath caught in her throat. "What do we do now?" Jake didn't hesitate. "We move. We can't stay here. They're expecting us to be in the motel, but we have to get ahead of them. We can't let them take you." Emma nodded, her eyes filled with determination. She trusted Jake, and he could see that in her eyes. He wasn't going to let her down. They turned and slipped out of the alley, heading toward the edge of town. The car was still there, parked a few blocks away, but Jake kept his distance, knowing that they had to stay out of sight. They moved through the streets quietly, sticking to the shadows, hoping to stay one step ahead of whoever was hunting them. Jake didn't know how long they had before the men found them again, but he was going to make sure they didn't find Emma. Not if he could help it. The darkened streets of the small town seemed to close in on Jake and Emma as they moved through the shadows. They had been walking for what felt like hours, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the cold, damp pavement. The night air was thick with tension, each corner they turned feeling like a potential threat. The men who had been after them were close, and every move Jake made, every step he took, was calculated to keep Emma out of harm's way. He could feel her anxiety as they walked, her hand gripping his arm tightly. It wasn't just fear anymore, it was desperation. She had seen what these men were capable of, and she was starting to understand just how dangerous this situation had become. "We're almost there," Jake whispered, his voice low but firm. Emma nodded, her gaze darting around the street, still on edge. They were heading toward a nearby warehouse, a place Jake had used as a safe house in the past. It wasn't much, but it would be enough to give them some time to regroup. They had to stay ahead of the men who were chasing them, and Jake knew they couldn't afford to make any more mistakes. As they reached the edge of the warehouse district, Jake motioned for Emma to stay close. He moved silently, his footsteps light but purposeful as he approached the door of the old building. The warehouse was dark, the only light coming from a few dim street lamps scattered along the perimeter. It was the perfect place to hide. Jake pushed the door open slowly, careful not to make any noise. The hinges creaked as it swung inward, but it was just enough to slip inside unnoticed. He motioned for Emma to follow, and they both entered the darkened interior. The musty smell of old wood and metal hit them immediately. The warehouse had been abandoned for years, and the dust and cobwebs were a testament to its long neglect. Jake didn't mind. The place was secure, and that was all that mattered right now. As they moved deeper into the warehouse, Jake's eyes scanned the space. The floor was littered with debris, old crates and barrels stacked haphazardly along the walls. There was a small storage area in the back that had once been used for supplies, and that's where Jake planned to set up for the night. They needed to rest, but Jake knew they couldn't let their guard down. He still didn't know who these men were, or why they were after Emma, but the fact that they had been so persistent meant they were dangerous. "Stay here," Jake said softly, pointing to a corner of the room where some old blankets were piled up. "I'm going to check the perimeter." Emma nodded, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and gratitude. She hadn't said much since they left the motel, but Jake could tell she was trying to process everything. She wanted to trust him, and he wasn't about to let her down. As he moved toward the door, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The quiet of the warehouse was unsettling, and the longer they stayed in one place, the more exposed they were. Jake had been in enough situations to know that staying still for too long was a mistake. He needed to find out where the men were and how close they were to catching up with them. He moved quickly but carefully, making his way through the darkened warehouse. His hand rested on the grip of the knife at his side, ready to react if needed. The building was empty, save for the sound of his footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. Jake paused at a broken window near the back of the warehouse, peering out into the night. The street was still, but the headlights of a car illuminated the far end of the block. It wasn't much, but Jake knew it was only a matter of time before they were spotted. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not now. He turned back to Emma, his face grim. He needed to move again. "Emma," he called softly. She looked up from her corner, her expression fearful but determined. "We have to go," Jake said, his voice urgent. "They're getting closer." Emma didn't hesitate. She stood up, her small hands trembling as she adjusted her jacket. "Where do we go?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake scanned the room, quickly formulating a plan. "There's a place about 30 minutes away," he said. "We can hide there, lay low for a while." Emma nodded, but Jake could see the doubt in her eyes. "We can't keep running forever," she said, her voice barely audible. Jake's heart ached for her. He knew she was right, but he wasn't about to give up. "We won't have to," he said firmly. "We just need to get somewhere safe. We'll figure it out from there." With that, he turned and led Emma toward the back of the warehouse. The door creaked again as they exited, and Jake's eyes scanned the street for any sign of the men. He couldn't afford to be caught off guard. As they moved through the shadows, Jake kept his senses sharp, listening for any sounds of pursuit. The streets were still quiet, but he knew they couldn't afford to be complacent. He had to stay one step ahead. They continued down the darkened street, their footsteps muffled by the damp ground. Jake's mind raced as he tried to piece together the puzzle. Who were these people? What did they want with Emma? And why was her father involved? There were too many questions and not enough answers. But Jake was determined to get to the bottom of it. Emma deserved answers, and he was going to make sure she got them. They reached the edge of town, and Jake slowed his pace. They were getting closer to the place he had in mind. It wasn't much, but it was better than the streets. As they walked, Jake couldn't help but glance over his shoulder one last time. The car was still there, parked at the far end of the block, its headlights now off. But Jake knew better than to assume they were safe. The men were still out there, still looking for them. And they weren't going to stop until they found Emma. The night felt even darker as Jake and Emma walked down the street, their footsteps muffled by the damp ground beneath them. They had been moving for what felt like hours, but every corner Jake turned, every street they passed, only deepened the sense of urgency. The men chasing them were still out there, and Jake knew they were getting closer. Every passing minute brought them closer to the moment when they would either be caught or find the answers they so desperately needed. The streetlights overhead flickered sporadically, casting a dim, eerie glow over the pavement. Jake's eyes scanned the surroundings, ever watchful. They were nearing a small, isolated diner on the outskirts of town, a place that had been his refuge in the past. It wasn't much, but it was secluded, and for now, that was all he needed. As they approached the diner, Jake slowed down, his hand resting on the grip of his knife. The quiet hum of the world around them only made the tension more palpable. He glanced at Emma, who was walking closely behind him, her eyes still wide with fear, but determined to stay strong. She had trusted him so far, and he wasn't about to let her down. They reached the diner, and Jake gave the door a quick push. The bell above the door chimed softly as they entered, and the warm, greasy smell of fries and coffee filled the air. It wasn't exactly a comforting aroma, but it was familiar. A quiet murmur filled the room, the low voices of a few truck drivers sitting at the counter, nursing their cups of coffee. Jake moved swiftly to a booth in the back, keeping Emma close to him. He knew they couldn't stay long, but they needed a few moments to breathe, to think. Once they were seated, Jake kept his gaze on the door, watching for any signs of trouble. Emma sat quietly across from him, her hands clutching her jacket tightly as she stared down at the table. She didn't speak at first, and Jake didn't push her. He knew she had a lot on her mind. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Emma spoke. "Do you think they'll find us here?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the room once more. "I don't know," he admitted. "But we're not sitting still for long. We'll keep moving, stay ahead of them." Emma nodded slowly, though Jake could see the doubt in her eyes. She had every right to be scared. They had no idea what they were up against, who was pulling the strings, or why they were after her. But Jake wasn't going to let her fall into their hands. He promised himself that. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with a tired smile, came over and took their order. Jake barely looked at the menu before asking for a coffee and a sandwich. Emma ordered something light. She hadn't eaten much since they started running, and Jake could tell it was starting to take a toll on her. She was tired, both physically and emotionally. As the waitress walked away, Jake leaned in a little closer, lowering his voice. "I know you're scared," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "But we're going to get through this. You're not alone." Emma looked up at him, her expression softening for just a moment. "I'm not used to this," she whispered. "To all of this danger. I've never been in a situation like this before." Jake's heart clenched. He couldn't imagine what it felt like to be Emma, just a kid, thrust into a world of secrets, violence, and fear. "I know," he said quietly, "but I've been in situations like this before, and I know what it takes to survive. And we will survive this." Emma nodded slowly, her eyes searching his face as if trying to find the strength she needed. She had no reason to trust him, no reason to believe that he could protect her, but he could see that she wanted to. And that trust, however fragile, gave Jake the strength he needed to keep going. Their food arrived, and they ate in silence, the weight of the situation hanging over them both. Jake's thoughts were racing, trying to piece together everything he had learned so far. The men who were after Emma, the mysterious briefcase, the names, none of it made sense. But he knew one thing for sure. Whoever was behind all of this was dangerous, and they would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. When they finished eating, Jake paid the bill in cash, leaving just enough for a generous tip. He didn't want to draw attention to themselves, and paying in cash was the easiest way to avoid leaving a trail. He stood up, motioning for Emma to follow him. They stepped back out into the cold night, the streets still eerily quiet. Jake glanced up at the sky. There was a light drizzle falling now, the cold droplets mixing with the humidity in the air. It didn't matter. They had no choice but to keep moving. "We need to go," Jake said, his voice low but firm. Emma looked up at him, her face set in determination. "Where now?" she asked. Jake glanced around, trying to make a quick decision. "There's a place about 15 miles out," he said. "We'll lay low there for a bit, figure out our next move." Emma nodded, her eyes meeting his with a new sense of resolve. She wasn't just following him anymore. She was ready to fight, too. As they walked toward the parking lot, Jake's mind kept returning to the men who had been chasing them. He didn't know who they were or who they worked for, but he did know one thing. They were dangerous, and they wouldn't stop until they found Emma. He had to stay ahead of them, stay one step closer to finding the truth. He wasn't sure where this road was leading, but he was determined to protect her, no matter what. The ride to the next town was tense. Jake kept his eyes on the road ahead, but his mind was elsewhere, racing through possibilities. The night felt colder now, and the constant hum of the motorcycle beneath him did little to ease his nerves. Emma sat behind him, still clutching his jacket as they sped through the quiet streets. She had barely said a word since they left the diner, her thoughts clearly consumed by everything that had happened. Jake knew she was scared, but there was something else there, too, something stronger. She wasn't just running from the people after her. She was trying to figure out the truth, just like he was. As they reached the outskirts of the next town, Jake slowed the bike, steering them down a narrow dirt road. He didn't want to take any chances, and the less attention they drew, the better. They'd find a place to lay low for a while, regroup, and figure out their next move. Jake stopped the bike in front of a small, run-down cabin that seemed to be the only building on the road. It wasn't much, but it would do. The faded paint and overgrown weeds made it look abandoned, but Jake knew better. He had used this place before, back when he was on the run from his own past. It was off the radar, hidden from prying eyes, and that was exactly what they needed right now. As Jake helped Emma off the bike, she looked at the cabin with a mix of hesitation and relief. "This place, it's safe, right?" she asked, her voice soft, but with a trace of doubt. Jake nodded, his gaze fixed on the cabin's door. "It's safe enough for now," he said. He knew that safe was a relative term, but he didn't want to worry her more than she already was. They walked up to the door, and Jake pushed it open. The inside was dusty, but it was solid, with enough furniture and supplies to get them through the night. There was a small wood stove in the corner, and a few old blankets strewn across the floor. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. As they settled in, Emma immediately went to sit by the stove, wrapping herself in one of the blankets. Jake couldn't help but notice how small she looked, how vulnerable, sitting there in the dim light. She was just a kid caught in a nightmare she didn't ask for. He hated that she had to be here, in this situation. But as much as he wanted to keep her safe, he knew the battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. Jake sat down across from her, his mind still reeling from everything they had uncovered. The envelope, the names, the briefcase, it was all connected, but the truth was still out of reach. Whoever was after Emma wasn't going to stop until they had what they wanted, and Jake had no idea how deep the rabbit hole went. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, and stared at Emma. "We'll figure this out," he said quietly, his voice firm despite the uncertainty in his chest. Emma looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. She wasn't a child anymore. Not after everything she had been through. "I don't want to run anymore," she said, her voice shaky but resolute. "I want to know what's going on. Why are they after me? Why was my dad involved?" Jake sighed, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He knew she deserved answers. She deserved to understand what had happened to her father, to herself. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that finding those answers was going to be dangerous. The men after them weren't just random criminals. They were part of something bigger, something much darker. Jake didn't want to get Emma tangled up in that world, but he also Couldn't leave her in the dark. He stood up, walking over to the small table where he had left the map. We can't stop until we know who's behind all of this, Jake said, more to himself than to her. But we need to be smart about it. We need to stay ahead of them. Whoever they are, they have the resources to find us. We can't let that happen. Emma nodded slowly, still wrapped in the blanket. She seemed to be processing everything, the weight of their situation settling in. How do we start? She asked, her voice quiet but determined. Jake paused, looking out the small window of the cabin. The night was dark, the only sound the rustle of the trees in the wind. He had no clear answer, but he knew they couldn't just sit here and wait. They had to make a move. First, we need to find out who the hell is behind all of this, Jake said, his tone resolute. And then, we deal with them. Emma stood up, walking over to him. You're right, she said, her voice stronger now. We need to find out the truth. Jake looked at her, seeing the fire in her eyes. It reminded him of someone, a younger version of himself. Back when he had a cause, before everything went wrong. He hadn't realized until now, but Emma had grown up in front of him. She wasn't just a scared kid anymore. She was ready to face whatever came next. All right, Jake said, his voice steady. We'll do this together. And we won't stop until we find the answers. The two of them stood there in the quiet cabin, the weight of the road ahead pressing down on them. Jake wasn't sure how this was going to end, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let anyone harm Emma. No matter what it took, he would protect her. Together, they would uncover the truth. And together, they would fight to make sure the past didn't define their future.